Christians always say they're under a new covenant, that the Mosaic covenant, or the covenant of Noah, the covenant of the Davidic covenant, the Mosaic covenant, etc. The Old Testament covenants are not binding on Christians, because Christians are under the new covenant of Jesus Christ. Well, there's a major problem with that, and the major problem is, if you read the New Testament, it says go back to the Old Testament for morals, guidance, etc., etc. Jesus says in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5, verses 17 to 18, that I do not come to think that I've come to destroy the law. I've not come to destroy the law, but to fulfill it. That means that the Old Testament laws are still binding. Jesus further says that Scripture cannot be broken in the Gospel of John. So that means that the Old Testament laws are still binding, etc. 2 Timothy chapter 3 verse 16 says, all Scripture is good for training, morality, training in righteousness and morality, etc. So when the author of 2 Timothy is talking about all Scripture, he's talking about the Old Testament. He's not talking about the New Testament, because there was no canonization of the New Testament when 2 Timothy was written. So Christians have to respect and obey and find righteousness and morality from the Old Testament. That means the horrible things you read in the Old Testament, the moral problems with, Moses, Abraham, David, Solomon, etc. They're all binding on Christians. Christians can't get away with the moral problems of the Old Testament and the problematic teachings of the Old Testament regarding women, warfare, slavery, etc. They can't get away with the problems of the Old Testament, or the moral problems of Old Testament figures like David, Solomon, Abraham, Moses, etc., etc. So what that means is that the Old Testament books are still binding, or they're still good for, they're all inspired, as 2 Timothy says. So that means that God inspired all the terrible and horrible things you read in the Old Testament regarding women, warfare, slavery, etc., and other unjust laws. God allowed it. According to the New Testament, God allowed all these things, and it was all inspired. So Christians can't say they're under a new covenant when the New Testament says go back to the Old Testament or the Old Covenant for